So we are back online for the very last talk of the summer for TypeParis. And I have the pleasure to announce that Sumner Stone will be the speaker. So I have to introduce Sumner, and I've wrote a small text about you. Ah, even connected to Stefan. Sumner is a crucial figure in the development of digital typeface. I have heard about Sumner Stone the first time back in the 90s in upper and lowercase. At the time, he's just launched his own foundry, Stone Type Foundry, and place his ads on this magazine from ITC, upper and lowercase, along Matthew Carter, who launched also his individual foundry at the time. At this moment, I bought his book on ITC Stone that he just signed a few days ago for me. Thank you, Sumner. A typeface that he designed with the help of the pre-version of Illustrator back in the 80s to interpolate weight. He will probably correct me about this detail. In the mid-80s, he was the first director of typography at Adobe System, where he conceived and implemented Adobe typographic program, including the Adobe Originals, along with consulting on the development of Adobe type editing software. Without Sumner, we probably never have seen Trajan, Adobe Garamond, Caslon, Myriad as well, many great type designers hired by him, by Adobe, like Carol Tombly, Robert Slimbach, both recipients of the Charles Penneau Prize. Sumner was responsible for the development and invention of the Adobe multiple master technology and directing his initial development, basis of today's new evolution called variable fonts. When I have launched my foundry called at the time Porsche's Typo Foundry, this decision was directly influenced by his own Stone Type Foundry. He was my model, as at the time very few digital foundry have been launched. So when you have to launch a foundry, you have to have a proper name that people be able to recognize that it's a digital type foundry. So you have to follow a certain way to spell the name of the foundry. So now we have much more opportunity to find new words, and people will get the point that it's type foundry, but not at the time. So quickly after we meet at ATP in Antwerp in 1993, I asked him to use his end user license as a model for my version of my own end user license, as nobody doing that in France at the time. I have to adapt to the French intellectual property code at the time. I also hired Sumner to design a specific version of his Stone typeface for Le Monde newspaper where I was at the time. In '95, I invited him to speak at the Rencontre Internationale de Lure in south of France. Then in 2012, with Caradi Eduardo, they invited me to join Type Cooper to teach for 5 weeks, to which I invited Stefan to join us. So Sumner is not only a colleague, a mentor for me, he's a good friend since many years. Someone you like to spend time with, simple as that. Please welcome Sumner Stone for the last Type Talk of the season.
Thank you, Jean-François. I spent the day looking at the TypeParis 2017 students projects, which you may have already seen up on the board. And I want to compliment them on their work. This program, which is really modeled on the program that I helped to start up at Cooper Union in New York, is a 5-week marathon in which you start making type and you don't get to sleep until it's over. It is a wonderful thing to participate in because you really, I think almost everyone who does this surprises themselves by what they can accomplish in 5 weeks. And so it was a real pleasure to see the things that people have made and how much they've done in this time. And so I want to, it's always difficult to come in at the end of these projects and critique the work. I think it's of all, you know, I would have people come into my classes that I taught at Cooper, and the toughest thing was for it to come in right at the end when you really, you know, what are you going to say? Well, throw it out and start over. You're not going to say that. And yeah. So one of the things that that you wind up thinking about when you get to the end of this process is what next? Because you cannot do an entire family of typefaces in this time and finish it. You can make a start on. You can make a Roman typeface, for example, and then make an italic or part of an italic, part of a bold, maybe a black, and a few people actually get farther than that. They may make an italic and a bold and so on. And but inevitably, there is a stage when you begin thinking, okay, so what am I going to do? What else is there to add to this family? And it's a part of typeface design that I have tried to explore and think about ever since the first family that I did. So I'm going to focus, and Jean-François asked me to talk about my work. I'm going to focus on this specific topic that is in my work. And I can't even show you all of the sort of relevant wrinkles that go along with this, but that's going to be my main focus. Okay, so we will now start this guy. Okay, so it's not doing that. Oh, okay.
You see what I mean?
Okay.
I hope it will work.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not case before. Now,
Yeah. Should work. Yeah. Okay, so I have I've done a pretty good variety of different kinds of type. This little keepsake is a kind of a choosing of for the sake of variety, so that you can see that all my typefaces do not look the same. And I want to show you, give you a little introduction to what got me into doing this strange thing, because I think that's always a story. Type designers, until very recently, were not trained in academic institutions. There was no course in type design up until maybe a little over 12, 14 years ago, when the type design programs that we now really have two primary ones where you can get a degree, and those are at the University of Reading in England, and also in The Hague there is a program. And now at Cooper Union there is another program, but it's not really a degree granting situation, and it's shorter and so on. But it does, and I did teach in that, and it does offer an entry into the type design world. Yeah. Okay. That's oh yeah. Directly into it. I get it. Okay. This is calligraphy that I did in the 1970s in connection with publicity for a group called the Friends of Calligraphy in the San Francisco Bay Area. They have published a journal for many years called Alphabet, some of which there have been many different editors, and some of these have done an extremely fine job in putting this journal out. If you ever have a chance to look at them, some of them are quite fine. But in the very beginning, I did pretty much all the posters, and this is part of one of the posters for a talk. This was silkscreened. I did silkscreen and letterpress posters in my print shop. This was done about the same time in the 70s when I was living in Sonoma, which is in the wine country north of San Francisco, and I did quite a bit of work for the wine industry. This was, actually a restaurant, and there was a publication at the time called Fine Print, which was also published in San Francisco, which was about mostly American, not exclusively American, fine printing, and was very beautifully printed by letterpress. I had articles by people who were typographers and book designers and printers, and I wrote articles for them. And when they had their 10th anniversary, the editor asked a number of us to do some kind of piece of lettering or calligraphy to go in the issue. So this is my sketch for the piece that wound up in that issue. This was pencil. This is pen and ink, and here's the printed version from the journal. I really kind of fell in love with the notion of making outlined forms during that period, and so I did quite a few of them. And this is one of them that I have then since kind of explored as a digitized object. And my entry into digital type started in the late 70s when I went to work for a company called AutoLogic, which made really the first successful digital typesetting machine, used mostly by newspapers and very high volume printers. And at that time, in 1985, there was actually I think it was 1983 was the conference. There was a conference at Stanford University about digital type, and it was called The Computer and the Hand in Type Design, organized by Chuck Bigelow, who was became a teacher there. And I did this logotype for the conference. Don Knuth, who is a very famous computer scientist, was interested in typography, and he developed some computer tools. One of them is called Metafont, which you write code in order to make letters. And the other one is called TeX, Tau Epsilon Chi, TeX. TeX is still very widely used for all kinds of technical typesetting. If you're going to set math, you use TeX. And it has many, many users all over the world. And they have a users group, TeX users group. It's called Tugboat. Anyway, so Knuth actually wrote an article about my letter A, which he thought was quite odd. This was another job that I've done a couple of projects with a fine printer in San Francisco, the Arion Press, and they printed a Bible a few years back, and asked me if I would do these initial letters, that big I, and this is all set in Romulus, one of Jan van Krimp's typefaces. And these are the initial letters for each book of the Bible. In 1984, I went to work for Adobe, and they hired me to be the director of their typographic program. And they had already made versions of these three typefaces when I arrived. They started out by having the wives of the initial employees of the company digitize Times, Helvetica, and Courier. They then realized that they needed to hire somebody who might give them more professional information and expertise. So these are not those original versions. I think that they didn't really realize the implications in the beginning of what they were doing. I was employee number 25 at Adobe, and I then went about hiring people to produce type. But the laser writer, which was where these typefaces first resided, was the first PostScript printer to make it into the light of day. It was Apple's first printer that was not a dot matrix printer. They didn't have any laser printer before that. And it cost $7,000 in 1985 to buy one of these things, and they could not make them fast enough. It just flew off the shelves. It was a huge hit. And along with the Mac, and along with PageMaker, which you could make up pages, in what we call WYSIWYG at the time, what you see is what you get. It completely changed the whole graphic design industry. It took a few years, but how many of you work on a Macintosh? How many of you work on a computer? Almost everybody. So it changed everything. It changed everything pretty fast. And I have met, as I've traveled around the country giving talks and workshops, I have met people who teach in graphic design programs in colleges and universities in America. And a good number of the people who are teaching there were people who were the early adopters of who bought the first little Macs and, put up with all the wrinkles and made graphic design. One of the things to notice about these three typefaces is they don't really seem to relate to one another at all. And they were chosen because Times was the most popular serif typeface. Helvetica was and this is from data from Linotype. Helvetica the most popular sans, and Courier was the most popular typewriter typeface. I'm not sure how they determined that. It's interesting that these were the three categories that they thought were significant: serif, sans, and typewriter. And typewriter meant monospace, which is a big deal in the world of people who write code. And I could give a half-hour lecture on that, but I'm not going to. But in any case, so I actually think that the choice of Helvetica, which was already very popular, no question about it, but I think that the choice of putting that on the computer, especially the very first time, really boosted Helvetica up to a new level and was put a cap on the phenomenon of the sans serif world that we now live in, and it just created a kind of momentum for the sans, and not necessarily for Helvetica anymore. There are so many competitors, but I think that had a significant effect. I think there are other reasons too, but that's one of them. So I want to give you a little history before I go into my first typeface family of what typeface families are about. This is an election poster from a wall in Pompeii. It was made, and we know that it was made in 79 AD because it's advertising people who were candidate in that year, in the year that Vesuvius buried them. So the interesting thing about this is that there are two styles. There's the style of the huge letters, which is a kind of a smoking gun that really helps to understand and believe the theory that Edward Kadich had about the imperial Roman capitals, in particular the ones that were used on the inscription at the bottom of Trajan's column. Because they're clearly made with a brush, and they're not exactly like the imperial Roman letters, but they're damn close. And they have, at the bottom of them, you know, these symmetric serifs, which it turns out Kadich, if you're not familiar with his work, was trained as a sign painter as a young man. And he saw these things and he just said, I know how those were made. Well, that was not the theory at the time about why these letters had serifs and a particular kind of serif. And then below them you see what we now call the rustic style, the rustica, and that was also written with a brush. You can see it quite clearly, and this could have been written with another edge tool, like a pen, if it were on a different surface. But this is a rough wall. You have to write with a brush. So those two styles are part of the same message. They're part of the same poster. They are used together. This configuration happens on many Roman inscriptions, especially in like 1st and 2nd century AD, where you have the headline in a formal Roman letter, and then the text is in a less formal letter. They're not always these kind of rustics. The rustic is a style which varies quite a bit. But here we have, you know, 1st century AD, we have people mixing typefaces together. So it's an old tradition. And it's interesting that this happens in our tradition, the Roman tradition, because it doesn't really happen that often in other writing systems. It happens in Japanese. They have kana. They have these simplified phonetic characters that are really based on a more cursive style. They have two styles of them, and they get set right in the text. And so that's an example. But in the Arabic tradition, for example, and in the Egyptian tradition, this doesn't really seem to have happened very often. Mostly, you just see one style. And that style is regarded as being appropriate for the thing you're doing. But it's not like they get mixed together. So here we go. This is now, I believe this is from the 11th century. And how many styles do we have? On the top, I'm going to use the pointer here. On the top, no. Where's the, oh, there. Back. What happened? Just bear with me for 1 second here. Okay, so that style is called Uncal, U-N-C-I-L. The text is set in what we now refer to as the Carolingian minuscule. This was a result of Charlemagne, the Emperor Charlemagne, declaring that we were going to get everybody to write the same way. And basically, people who wrote formal letters were mostly in monasteries. And the way this worked was, there was one monastery where they started doing this, and they sent manuscripts. And before too long, it worked. They're pretty much Charlemagne's whole, what had been his kingdom, they were all writing this style as the main text style. And this style is what was revived in the Italian Renaissance and is the precursor of our lowercase letters. So it was a very good choice, we think, and it has had a very strong effect. Okay, and then the admissum and the super oblata and the post-communion, those are in a kind of a rustic style, which was the same style we saw on the bottom of the election poster. On the left, you have these filled-in letters, which are usually called versals. They begin a verse, but those are really based on the imperial Roman letters. They're kind of a simplification of them, and these are a little narrow, but that's where they come from. And this thing up in the left, the big S, what a wonderful thing that is. I think that can be pretty directly traced to the Irish. This is the Irish made exquisite manuscripts, but they also did a lot of metal work. They developed letter forms which had this braid effect. And then a bunch of them went to Europe as basically missionaries to convert people and to establish monasteries. And the effect of that in those monasteries that had scriptoriums was that we still have a lot of stuff that really can be traced back to those Irish and English manuscripts, which happened in like 6th, 7th century. So here we have what? 1, 2, 3, 4, really 5 styles if you count the initial letter. Okay, so yeah. This is a famous type specimen. It's called the Egenolf-Berner specimen, and it's from 1592. And it shows the actual typefaces of Claude Guéramont. And it also shows italic by Grandjean, Robert Grandjean. And you can see, if you look down here at the 3rd paragraph down, it says Romain Gros, texte de Guéramont. You look 1, 2, 3 on the bottom line. What are those things? Small capitals. Small capitals. And then when you look at 16th century books, small capitals are everywhere. They love them. So here we have, we have an italic, we have a Roman, we have the capitals and the lowercase, which don't really start to be used together until pretty late on in the beginning of the 16th century. And we have Greek. All of them obviously to be used together. That's the way they're displayed in the specimen. We now have a number of examples of typefaces in which what we call super families. And superfamilies refer to typefaces which contain things that are beyond what we have normally considered to be a family. And what a family was is what really, you found on the menu, the font menu In the beginning, you get Roman, you get italic, you get bold, you get bold italic. That's kind of the standard issue family. The bold italic is actually a late comer. But this is all the way back to the early 20th century. This was designed by this wonderful Dutch designer, Jan van Krimpen. He made a sans serif typeface to go with his serif typeface that already existed. He also made a Greek. But the sans serif typeface never got produced. It just sort of petered out. Didn't happen. It looks a heck of a lot like Gil Sans, I have to say. And it was made after Gil Sans. So that might have had something to do with it. On the other hand, if you take any traditional Roman typeface, and this is definitely a traditional typeface of his above, and you make it into a sans serif, it has a real tendency to look a lot like Gil Sans. Or if you don't quite take all of the serifs off, then it looks like Optima. So this is the background for my making the Stone superfamily, which consisted of 3 main typefaces, serif and sans serif, but also something that I called informal. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. So here they are. This is the way they appeared when they were announced in upper and lower case, which Jean-Francois mentioned. And I'm going to show you, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but here the serif is used up on the top, and then the sans serif. This is a wonderful natural history guide of birds done by a man named Sibley, who did these fabulous drawings. Here is a guide for Yosemite. This is using primarily the serif typeface. Here is a number of European newspapers adopted these typefaces and used them. This one is a German newspaper. And then by the very kind action of Gudrun Zapf, it got used in the Gutenberg Jahrbuch 2 years in a row. This is the informal type that they used on the spine. And this is what the interior of that looks like. So it's got the informal type as a headline, and then the serif type for the text, and then the sans serif type is used in the captions. This is a high school textbook for French students. This is, I'm not going to actually talk about that. Okay, this is Roman newspaper. It's from 1998. This is L'Unità. It was the communist newspaper. And I thought, well, the reason they chose my typeface was because it sort of all gets along with each other. And they use all 3 versions in the newspaper. The whole newspaper pretty much set in it. Not anymore, of course, but here's a Dutch railway brochure using the serif type. Here's a stamp using the sans. And this publication is a thing that I bought for my daughter when she was young. It's called Click Magazine, and it uses all 3 typefaces. A serif on the top. How can that be? Somebody is calling me. All right, so, and then it's the sans is used for the byline, and the informal is used for the text. And they actually use this typeface through the whole magazine, except for the cover, which uses one of Matthew Carter's typefaces. Here is the italic, serif italic, and these guys who make this homeopathic medicine use my typefaces on almost all their products, which I always love when I go into the store and see them. This is very recent. This was in the Art Historical Museum in Vienna. I just took it, you know, a little over a week ago. That's the sans serif typeface, and then this is the labels in that same museum, which also uses the sans serif. And this is in what's called the Carriage Museum in Vienna. It's actually quite a wonderful museum, and they had these also using the sans serif typeface. This is walking on the street in Amsterdam, where I was right before I came here. That the Steenhouwers means something about bricks, bricklayers or something like that. And I couldn't find what the top word meant. I have a feeling that might have something to do with scaffolding. Anyway, so one of the wonderful things that happened with this typeface was that I was approached by a very wild character who lived up in Vancouver, BC, and about doing a metal version of the typeface. And he had purchased the remains of the American Monotype Company and had all their equipment. It didn't all work. But he hired a mechanical engineer and he got a lot of it to work. And he sent me this, and we actually, using the punch cutting machine, cut a capital H. And so the capital H that's on the bottom was printed letterpress from those metal H's that we cast on the Monotype machine, and the top is on the laser printer. We did I actually had Carol Twombly do this, a version of the typeface that was meant for display. So it has much thinner thins, it's much more sort of elegant looking, and it got used on this manual, it got used a bunch of other places, but for in-house publications, but it never got put up for sale. This was my advisory board at Adobe, and the joke about this is that what happens to you when you come to California. There's, starting on the bottom row, that's Alvin Eisenman, who was the head of the graphic design program at Yale, me, Jack Stoffaker, one of the fine printers in San Francisco, Lance Heide, very fine designer of books and posters, this guy you might know, Roger Black, and up there is a guy who worked for WGBH in Boston for many, many years, and his name will come to me right after I change the slide. This was our logo type. I had a discussion with the guys who were the founders of the company when they asked me to join them. I said, well, I will do this on the condition that you will fund the making of new original typefaces. And they looked at me like, well, of course, you know. They were from Xerox PARC, a research institution. They believed in innovation. And I think they thought it was rather silly of me to even ask them that. But in fact, they were true to their word. They were very happy to have us develop new typefaces, and so we did. And I initially did the stone typefaces, and at that time Adobe did not sell any retail products. Their whole business was in licensing PostScript, the language, and an interpreter that went in printers or image setters, and that was it. And a lot of those guys who worked on that didn't want to be in the retail business, but they did it anyway. And they did it because of Illustrator. And Illustrator was developed from the software that we made for editing the fonts. Because once you can move Béziers around, you've basically got the hardest part done. This is Trajan. The Trajan story you can read on a blog on my website. So I'm not going to go into it, but the reason I made this was because of an ad which was actually run by Linotype, which said something like English Helvetica. It was set in Gill Sands. This is the Adobe Garamond, one of the first typefaces we did. Robert Slimbach designed it. The Trajan was drawn by Carol Twombly. Of course, both of these typefaces, we really tried to be as accurate as we could about making them close to the original typefaces. And that was highly dependent in the case of the Trajan typeface on the research that was done by Edward Kadich on the Trajan inscription, which, you know, these remarkable books, including one called The Origin of the Serif. When I left Adobe, and Jean-Francois wanted me to say a few words about what it was like to deal with being in charge of the whole typographic program at Adobe, because it did really change my perspective on making typefaces in many ways, because I felt like I was responsible for trying to figure out, well, what do we need? What are we going to make? You know, what is the market? The market was completely changing. Basically, a huge new user group for type. And that has continued right up to the present day. And in fact, I think the reason that we have so much interest in typography and type in the graphic design world now is, you know, a direct result of everybody having the ability to look at typefaces and choose them and make them. And I know a lot of people, some of them are parents of my daughter's friends who teach at the university where I live, who have nothing to do with design or typography, but they are absolutely fascinated by typefaces. They're like, you know, type geeks, somehow amateur type geeks. So I left Adobe, I started Stone Type Foundry, and this was my original logotype that I used on the labels. These were labels that went for floppy disks because there was no internet. I sold stuff by mail order. The first typeface that I did for the Stone Type Foundry was a commission which I got from Print Magazine. It was a typeface for the text of Print Magazine. And the idea, which was presented to me, was that they wanted to have a typeface that would take up less space because they wanted more room to put illustrations in the magazine. And so I said, okay, fine, we're going to make a condensed typeface, but I want to make sure that we don't make a typeface that's so condensed that it's hard to read. And these guys who, at that time, who ran print were all writers. They were not designers, they were writers. And so they were quite receptive to not having their words, you know, be difficult to read. So this is a thing which I was talking to the students about today, is that the process that I went through in order to arrive at these shapes was to keep making them a little bit more condensed, until I thought it's broken. And I think that's a very valuable thing to do in all kinds of design, is to find where the limits are. You know, get to the extreme, break it, and then you know you can back up a little bit and you'll be okay. I did do some what I considered to be tricks, which was, for example, I made the, and the main thing that I was competing with, I thought, was there were two typefaces that were my competition. One of them was Times Roman, which if you at that time went and looked through magazines, probably more than half the magazines were set in Times. The other ones were mostly sent in the same typeface that was used in print at that time, which was called Century Old Style. Century Old Style and Times. Times is a little bit more compact than Century Old Style, but not very much. Century Old Style is right up there. So that was the reason that these guys, it's the same reason why most paperbacks were printed in Times Roman, because you can read it, but it takes up less space than Garamond, for example, or the sort of traditional text typefaces in general. So that was, my goal was to beat Times in being compact. I made, and one of the things, if you look at Times, that's kind of funny, and it's based on, to a certain extent, on Plantin. You can look at that too. There is writing about this. Is that the round characters, like the O, C, and E, are pretty round. They're big. They're wide. The H, M, and N, and U are narrow. So I thought, okay, well, why don't we make, particularly the E for English is the most common letter. If we make that narrow, that's a win. So I also did some other things, like I thought, well, the more space we can capture inside the letter forms, the more legible this will be. Even though we're squeezing it this way, let's try to capture more space. So I made, for the H and the N are curved. If you look at the serifs are heavier on the outside than they are on the inside. That was all about trying to capture more space. This is the cover of the magazine when the typeface was introduced. And I have a funny little thing to say about this, but I'm going to skip it. And this is the inside of the magazine when they started using the type. This is the bold version of the type and used in a little publication that I put out, which now seems rather odd to me. But and this is an article by the Swiss type designer and scholar Max Frisch, and it's in German, but very nice article. And so that really was, although it was the first typeface that I made after I left Adobe, I thought, okay, well, what I really want to do is I want to make a big family of typefaces that includes narrower and wider versions, and also includes typefaces that are made for specific sizes. So I embarked on that project, and I actually thought it was probably a really good idea to do the condensed one first. You know, there aren't that many condensed serif typefaces. The one that you see all the time is ITC Garamond condensed. It's a wretched typeface, pardon my saying so. The guy who designed that typeface is really good. But it's too narrow, you know, and you see stuff said in it and it's kind of irritating. But it gets used all the time because it's been around, and there it is. So these were sketches I did. So this stuff on the right is, you know, my initial drawings for the stone typeface, and you can see, you know, at some point it had this really nice curve on the inside. This one is less curved, but then I made a wider version, but I was still retaining that configuration of the serifs where they're thinner on the inside. And then I did, you know, a grid of interpolation of both weight and width. So you see going from, you know, from the top to the bottom, you see wide to narrow, and then left to right, you're seeing increase in weight. This was really, while I was developing the print typeface, I did this. And I was very interested in the time at making typographic systems, about the use of interpolation. Interpolation was a thing that we explored. As Jean-François said, I was the one who thought up and proposed to Adobe what's called a multiple master system, which some of you may not even know about. But it basically, the idea was that you could make a typeface that you would deliver as a product, and then the end user could choose any of the points in between the extremes of the typeface and make that into a font that you could use. For various reasons, Adobe gave up on it. I left. That was the initial problem. But then there were all sorts of reasons why it was not very well accepted. I think the primary reason was simply that the user interface was difficult to use. There were bugs. It wasn't built into anything. You actually had to have a separate application to make it work. And then there wasn't really much attempt to give people guidance about how to use it or why you might want to use it and so on. So it died. Now it has come back in the form of what Jean-François said, what are called variable fonts, which have now been put into the spec for OpenType. And if we're lucky, we might actually get to make some. One of the things that I was interested in because of the print typeface was the relationship between line length and letter width. And so these are a narrow letter on the left and a shorter line length, but the number of character, the words in all of these are the same. So this was one of the little experiments that I did. Here you got some even wider ones. I do actually think that there's something to the notion of having a relatively condensed type to use for narrow columns, because you get a better breaks. Basically, you can fit more characters on a line. It gives you a little bit more flexibility. Okay, so I then decided I would make a typeface that was really intended for books. It's called Cycles. And Cycles was going to be the wider version of print, but also with the additional features of being made for different sizes. And what I thought was, why don't I make just things that are targeted for the traditional metal, some traditional metal sizes. So that's what I did. I made 5-point, 7-point, 9-point, 11-point, 18-point, 24-point, 36-point. And these typefaces, so there you can see the kinds of changes that I made in just these characters, going on the left from, so there it goes, 11, 9, 7, 5. And you know, the basic drill is, if you look at what has been done historically, is you have less contrast as you get smaller, you have a bigger X height, and you make it a little heavier. So and also what you realize is that the amount of change between a one point size and the next increases as you get smaller, because the difference between 9 and 10 point is what, 10%. The difference between 5 and 6 point is much bigger. It's much bigger. So it, you know, as you go down in size, you have to sort of exaggerate things more in order to make them work. One of the early publications that was done with Cycles was this journal, which I edited for the A-Type I. It took me an entire year to do this. And then I did another issue, which took me about a year and a half. And I figured at that rate, you know, it was going to be tough to do them. So we have 2 issues of this journal. Here's another pretty early use of the typeface, and there's a really good designer, book designer and exhibition designer and just generally graphic designer at Stanford, and she did this beautiful cover. And then Alvin Eisenman, who was on the type advisory board and had retired from his position at Yale, was asked to design this journal, the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he wanted to use my type. And actually the dataless is a one-of-a-kind thing. That's hand-lettered, but in the style of the typeface. And then he did this marvelous design for the journal. And they're still using the typefaces. The journal has changed a little bit in the design, but not a lot. And they send it to me for free because I didn't really get paid very much to do it. But I have been reading Daedalus now for, I don't know, so this is 07, so at least 10 years, but it was earlier than that. So then I felt like I really needed to make a typeface that was part of this Cycles family that was really for display, very specifically for display, bigger than 36 point. And so I embarked on this project to make a repo. And here, this is a repo italic. These are the original pencil drawings. Here's the type used on a book jacket. And here it is used printed letterpress, the Roman and the italic, and then some designers who have done really nice things with this. This is done by Henrik Berkvig, a Danish designer. Henrik did this one also. And then this was done by a man named Robert Dalrymple, who is a wonderful book designer and mostly does museum catalogs. And he told me that he has cornered the market for museum catalogs in Scotland. I went up to visit him in Edinburgh, and yeah, he does really beautiful. This is also his. And then this was done by a fine press in San Francisco, in California, Northern California, and it's basically a tribute to this man Wallace Stegner, who is one of our beloved authors. And I'm not going to tell that whole story. New Year's card. And then this one and some of the following ones are done by another really good book designer named Cameron Poulter, who is in Chicago, does work for the University of Chicago Press and some other university presses. And the reason that I'm not showing you much of text is because text is hard to show on the screen. It's hard, you know, you can't really see much. So these are all done also by Cameron. He really likes the typeface, and he even talked me into doing some extra characters for him. But he always sends me these things, the book jackets. And so then I decided later on, actually fairly recently, to do a version of a repo that's an inline, and this was my announcement of it. And then this was a few little things I put together just for advertising it. And Stanley Morrison did, in fact, write a book called Letterforms, but this is not the cover of it. It's a fake. Then I did a swash version of this typeface, which you cannot buy yet. Okay. So in the late 90s, I had an exhibition at the San Francisco Public Library. These are the pencil drawings for the Arepo caps up in that strip above. That's the actual typeface below. And as a result, they asked me to design a logotype for them. They had just moved into a new building, and they had had a logotype designed by one of the firms in San Francisco, and they did not like it. And they asked me if and this exhibition that I had in their new building was attended by more people than any exhibition they had ever had. That's why they asked me to do the logotype, I think. Anyway, this was the logotype. And I designed, as part of it, a typeface, which is, again, really part of this same Cycles family. Its intent was that the people in the library could use it for making flyers, making posters, doing the newsletter, correspondence. And so I tried to make it very simple, and I wrote a manual for them, and they're still using it at the library. There it is. Flyer. Another flyer. And this is part of their newsletter. How are we doing on the time here, John? Okay. I'm going to skip most of this one, but I will go through a little bit of it quickly. This is an ancient Greek inscription. This is on the base of a statue by a famous sculptor, Greek sculptor Praxiteles. And notice that there's this interesting swelling of the strokes. The strokes get heavier towards the ends. And this turns out to be a feature of some Roman typefaces. This one is in Rome still. It's an interesting one. I'm not going to say a lot about these. And then it became also something that happened during the Italian Renaissance, mostly in Florence, although some other parts of Tuscany have some of these letters too, and mostly in ecclesiastical settings, in churches or in baptistries or other places like that. And it is the thing that inspired Hermann Zapf to do Optima, these letter forms. There is a typeface that precedes Optima that I think must have been inspired by the same thing, which was done by a man named R. Hunter Middleton, who was the type director at the Ludlow Company for many years. And he did this typeface called Stellar, which I've always liked. And here are Hermann's sketches for Optima, which he did on Italian banknotes because Italian banknotes in 1950 were basically worthless. So there's Optima. Okay, I'm not going to talk about this one at all. And I'm not going to talk about that one. But I made a typeface that has swelling stems, a sans serif typeface. It does not have thick and thin parts the way Optima does, but it has these swelling stems. And you can see here the basis of the widths of the proportions of the typeface looking like Trajan and Adobe Garland. Let me fix this. Here's a letterpress printing. Here's another one by Robert Dalrymple. I did do a Greek, although you can't buy it. And this is by a woman named Susan Skarsgård, wonderful designer, calligrapher. And this was an announcement for the most recent version of the typeface. And there in New York, I guess 2 years ago now, maybe 3, Monotype put on an exhibition in the AIGA gallery, and in it was this thing that's on the top. It turns out that Dan Radigan, who was mostly responsible for putting on this exhibition, spent a lot of time prowling through the Monotype archives of type drawings, and he found this. And this was a typeface that Eric Gill proposed for Monotime to make after Gill. Well, it looks a hell of a lot like my typeface. And so I found that to be absolutely fascinating. And what Dan thought was that he just took Gill and whited out stuff, which could be. It kind of looks that way. This is the lowercase. And so these are some alternate characters in the typeface. I put in, you know, single story A and G, and also this uncial E. And then I did a whole uncial typeface, which is compatible with Magma in that it has the same weights. You can actually substitute character by character, these uncial characters into Magma. And I kind of got off on that whole idea. So here's, you know, at the top is pure Magma, at the bottom is pure Monk. M-U-N-C is actually an archaic word for M-O-N-K in English. And then in between are combinations of the two. So this was a thing which really struck me, and I carried it through to another typeface, which is this one, which is called Numa, which is based on the very early Roman inscriptions, of which there are only a tiny number. The number of typefaces, the number of inscriptions that we have, and this is up till a couple of years ago, I don't know if any have been discovered recently, but before 400 is 10 inscriptions. But they have these interesting experimental, obviously what were at the time kind of experimental characters, like those A's, which, you know, I passed up, but, you know, here they are. Those are the A's with the crossbar kind of stick. And this fascinating O, which is not joined at the bottom. The Greeks had two O's. You know, they had omega and omicron. Omicron and omega. Omega was the big one. Omicron was the small one. That meant short and long, basically. And so I wonder if this was a kind of a compromise to maybe try to make those two shapes into one O. These are the experimental letters that we have. The M persists quite on into even Roman, the earliest Roman inscription in stone, the Forum Sippus, has an M that looks a lot like that. The angular C. So what happened, you know, as the Greek letters get adopted by the Romans, one of the primary things that happens to the forms is that these angular shapes get rounded. So the Roman alphabet has many more round shapes in it than this ancient Greek. And there are a lot to be said about this. This is my original sketches for the typeface, all done in one morning. I just said, okay, now I'm going to make this into a typeface. I did this typeface in about 3 weeks. And here again is a mixture. At the top is the pure Numa, at the bottom is a pure Magma, and in between is a mixture. So you can mix these things together character by character. And here's a wonderful book title done by this fabulous designer at Stanford, Becky Fishbach, and I just love this thing that she did. And this was for an exhibition about artist books done by this guy. So here's a few things. Okay, thank you very much.
Any question for Sumner Stone? Yes.
This one.
Hello. So I noticed in that photo of, I think it was the early Adobe team. It was all men. And so I wanted to know if you've noticed a progression and more women leading, or more leading roles in the industry?
Yeah. Carol Tomley as one of the most great designer I know. So that's the two first designer he hired was a woman and a man.
Yeah.
We had
I'm sorry to answering for you, but
50% women in the first designers I hired, but there were only 2 of them. No, there has definitely been an increase in the number of women who are type designers. Thank goodness. It's a long history of males, but you know, it's interesting to read that there were, and I only recently have been seeing this research, there were entire scriptoria in the Middle Ages that were entirely women, and they did these beautiful manuscripts, and they're discovering more and more of this now, that there are women doing the research. So.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
more question?
It's late. Anyway, thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're not done yet?
There is one more question, yeah? No? Yeah, I was thinking that you wanted to ask a question, so yes, you?
Just a short question. What do you think of the recent trend of responsive typography? Because you imagine it back then in the day, but
Well, it's very good to hear Stefan explain the actual guts of how that gets done, and it's obviously necessary to do. It's just necessary to do. I mean, what are you going to do? You've got to have a design that works on all these different devices. You just have to have it. So the variable fonts were to a certain extent motivated by the notion that you could have a typeface that you could expand and contract to fit the column width. That is kind of, it just doesn't work when you're going from, the iPhone size to the big screen. It doesn't work. But it was an interesting thing that helped to motivate this innovation and the ability to make multiple basically interpolatable fonts. And I'm happy they're back. I hope that we get to make them. But yeah, it's an important thing, and strategies for how to do it, which I think was very interesting here. Stefan's strategy about how he went about it. Those are important. I have done my website so that you can actually reduce the whole page down on the iPhone, and you can pretty much still read it. So that's another much simpler, but not nearly as good strategy. It wouldn't be good for reading the news, for example. But that problem is not going to go away. We're going to just have to deal with it. So.
Could you have a tip for the people who work on the variable font to make that successful, that it wasn't the case with the multiple master? What you learned from these problems of, you refer to the user, or yes.
Yeah,
what
I'm working
mistakes they
on
don't have to do to make the variable fonts?
Well, the variable fonts are potentially useful in that situation. It's just that, the expectation that you can have a headline and then you can get it to fit simply by having a much narrower font on a small screen, that's somewhat unrealistic. But I am working on a typeface that has an extremely narrow version and an extremely wide version and multiple weights. And so, it could be used for such a thing. And if you look online and look at the stuff that's been written about the variable fonts, David Berlow did a whole bunch of kind of sample things, you know, that you can look at, and they're very interesting.
Does this mean that the user don't have to realize that the typeface have different widths or different weights? Because when we look to multiple...
the end user never sees any of this. This is just all happens automatically.
So if we compare to multiple master, in multiple masters, the user, the graphic designer, have to select the width he wants. On this, in this case, as you describe, it's more they apply a system, and after it's developed by itself, without the control. I mean, without to take a decision as a graphic designer, just using the typeface, and they will just develop. That's probably a tip to give to the variable font fan.
Okay, so it brings up a lot of issues, you know, this whole thing of making fonts that are variable. What good are they, and could you use them in this kind of context? And I think that's really unknown until we start. The things that I saw that were originally done were very primitive. They just use a really simple sans serif typeface. But the truth is that, you know, the people have an investment in how these things feel and look, you know, as being somehow related to the actual content of the material. And so we'll see. I don't know how relevant that particular application of the thing is. But the applications of being able to choose a weight or a series of weights for a specific publication or application, I think that's potentially very useful. And it's that we don't have experience in doing it, but I know from myself, from being able to do this on my own computer with my own typefaces, sometimes it's a really handy thing, and it solves a graphic design problem for you. So, you know, an example is when you've got a bunch of sans serif typefaces on the same page, but they're different sizes. How do they relate in weight? Well, sometimes it'd be really nice to have the smaller ones really look like the same weight as the bigger ones, but you don't always have the right thing to make that happen. But with this kind of application, you could make it really fast. So, and I think there are a lot of other similar issues. You know, one of the problems that I still see all the time is from people printing dropped out material in a light color on a dark background, and it you know, in the printing process, you lose stuff. And you can solve that very easily by a little variation in the thickness of the thin parts in the typeface. Then you have a thing that you can specifically use for dropping the type out. So there are a lot of applications, I think, like that. And those are all things that I thought about when I first was trying to sell this idea of the multiple master fonts to Adobe.
Any more questions? You have one?
Sumner, I'm curious to know, we're all sort of starting our type design career, and I feel like for me, I'll speak for myself, I have all these ideas rushing around in my brain for shapes that I want to get out of my head and put, you know, into the computer. And I'm not trying to imply that you're more towards the end of your career, but you are older than some of us. Is that, if that's okay to say?
You are.
Yeah, exactly. And so I'm curious to know, what has maybe the curve looked like over the years for you, for the ideas and shapes you have running around in your head that you want to create as a typeface? Has that slowed at all over the years? Has it risen? Do you still have an endless number of shapes you want to get out for yourself right now?
I have become much more experimental as I've gotten older, and willing to put up with stuff that doesn't seem to work in the beginning, but fiddling with it and see what will happen. And so I've made some pretty, some typefaces that might surprise some people in recent years that nobody has really seen. A few people have seen. And I don't know that it's really so much that I have shapes that I want to get out, but I am I am very interested in the sort of malleable nature of the type, and that video that you saw at the beginning was a thing that was actually I did for a project that never got used, but you know, I think we're just really at the beginning. We are in a very conservative time in typography. The sans serif typefaces just keep spewing out, and there's not much adventure really, except in these classes, and you know, it's beginning to happen. But it's slow so far. So I don't know how long that will last, how much adventure will come out. But there's certainly plenty to do, and there's plenty of interesting avenues to explore in typeface design. And I think that's one of the things that's happening in this TypeParis environment and other places where typeface design is getting taught. And you know, one of the things I'm working on is a book about typeface design, because I think this is not a fad that's going to go away. I think it's going to just increase. And one of the things that seems to be happening is that typeface design gradually is becoming a much more legitimate part of graphic design world. You know, I got my picture taken for print magazine with two other guys who are type designers in San Francisco, and they were taking pictures of graphic designers. And I told these two younger guys, I said, guess what? This never would have happened 20 years ago, that we got included as graphic designers. It just wouldn't have happened. So there is some growth there, you know, so we'll see.
In echo to your question, I just realized that you are the father of a very important step in technology, with the help of a lot of people at Adobe, obviously, but so it seems that you take the best of the technology to try to invent new forms who are based more and more to the most ancient time as possible. So you go in one direction with the technology, multiple master, optical size, all these things, and you go in opposite direction as a source of design. So why is, you say you were more traditional before, but in fact, you're going the other way. You go into direction completely reversed.
Yeah.
It's intentional, or you ever think about that, or it's
Well,
just because you ever love?
Yeah, no, this is a good question. I got very interested in the ancient Roman letter forms from the whole experience of the Trajan typeface becoming so popular. And I really wanted to learn more about it and the whole context of it, and also what came before that. Where did it come from? Because we don't know that. We don't even know who designed it. But I think what you can conclude if you look at, you know, the evidence is that it's very unlikely that a Roman designed that typeface. Very unlikely, because who made letters in the Roman world? Slaves made letters, or at best, freed men and freed women made letters. So, you know, and tracing them back and finding those really old things, those old forms.
Type designer to be good to be slave.
Fascinating, you know. Fascinating. So you know, letter forms in our tradition have a very low status. They started out being made by slaves. They're still kind of like that. We don't get paid like architects do, for example, right? So, no, I also am very interested in pushing the envelope about, and I hope I communicated that to some of you guys today, looking at your typefaces, in exploring other paths that we have not gone down. And I think we're right at the point where that may really start to happen, you know, that we begin to think about things in a different way. I did a workshop in Faenza. I had a small number of people, but what we did was I had them go out and take pictures the first morning of shapes. One woman took pictures of the shadows of the flags and then used those shapes to make letters. They did some amazing stuff. And I wanted them to stop thinking about the sort of traditional forms and start thinking about some other stuff about letter forms. And I showed them the cuneiform and how that evolved from pictures, modular forms, and so on. And I did another project earlier last year in which we actually made up a writing system by starting out with pictures and then simplifying the pictures and ultimately coming up with a set of forms that are unified in some way. So I think we are now at the point where we've got enough kind of energy behind what we're doing that we're going to start to see some of these things really turn into, you know, interesting and useful developments in letter form.
Thank you, Sumner, to give hope for the future. So that's the end. Thank you, Summer. Bye-bye for the live stream. That's the last talk of the summer. We hope to see you next year or perhaps in the winter. So bye-bye.